And you're listening to Morning Report on RNZ National. It's a wet one for some. Rain spreads to central and eastern North Island and the east of the South Island. Ko Corandan tēnei.
Ko Mani Dunlop tēnei. In this hour, the government moves on petrol and diesel pricing. We'll bring you the latest.
New figures show house prices are continuing to slide in Wellington more than anywhere else. We will speak to a local real estate agent.
Also before 9, an international financial consultant talks to us about the reappointment of Adrian Orr, and the Uruwera whānau are celebrating the return of stolen taonga. And how was the blood moon for you, Marama Kutsia? We speak to an astronomer about last night's eclipse.
RNZ News at 8 o'clock. Ngā mihi, good morning. I'm Nicola Wright. The government's giving the Commerce Commission the power to set fairer petrol and diesel prices. It's part of a suite of just-announced measures aimed at making the country's fuel system more secure and affordable. Here's our political reporter Katie Scotcher.
Wholesale fuel suppliers selling from terminals are currently required to share a daily spot price, but from mid-next year the Commerce Commission will be able to regulate that cost if the prices on offer are too high. Fuel importers and wholesalers with bulk storage facilities will be required to hold stocks of petrol, jet fuel and diesel on shore. The government will also secure additional onshore storage of reserve diesel stocks of at least 70 million litres. It says the measures will help shield the country from the risk of major disruption to fuel supplies.
House prices have fallen sharply over the past year, including an 18% drop in Wellington. The latest house price index from the state valuer QV shows the average value dropped nearly 4% over the 3 months to the end of October. Prices have also
the further you had to fall when the rubber meets the road, and that's really what we're seeing now.
The national average house price is about $950,000, about 5% down on a year ago. Falling house prices and an increase in inventory are helping first-time buyers get on the property ladder. The property research firm CoreLogic says first-time buyers made up 24% of buyers in the third quarter. That compares with 23% in the first half of the year and a long-term average of 22%. CoreLogic says the percentage change is small but significant, demonstrating the resilience of this group of buyers. 2 senior hospital doctors who are struggling to get residence visas say they're stuck in a quagmire of immigration bureaucracy. The married couple, cardiologist Rob McIntosh and haematologist Sarah Hartley, says it looks as though their family of 5 won't get approval until 2024, and they're asking why they moved to New Zealand. The couple are waiting in what was meant to be a year-long queue under the 2021 fast-track residence program. Dr McIntosh says that's turned into 18 months and it's likely to take even longer.
At their peak, they were processing about 570-odd people a day. Over the recent weeks, that's been progressively dropping, and now they're only processing 235 applicants a day, and there are 102,000 people left in the waiting list.
Rob McIntosh says he wouldn't encourage other foreign doctors to come to New Zealand. The Climate Change Minister says New Zealand's contribution to countries experiencing loss and damage from climate change will help other Pacific nations. Aotearoa has ring-fenced $20 million and joins a small group of countries that are doing this. James Shaw says comparatively wealthy countries such as New Zealand have a duty to support those most at risk from climate change.
That is really, I guess, a way of us saying that we're putting our money where our mouth is, that we are trying to amplify the Pacific priorities.
The money for loss and damage comes from revenue gathered from the emissions trading scheme. A financial consultant says there are no meaningful checks and balances on the current Reserve Bank governor. Adrian Orr has been given another 5-year term by the government in a move criticised by the National Party. A former senior Reserve Bank official, Jeff Mortlock, says a soon-to-be-released review into the Reserve Bank will hold little...
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming along this morning. I just want to have a chat about 3 key government policies that together aim to deliver a more resilient, sustainable and competitive fuel system. I'll speak briefly about each of these and then I'll take any questions that you have. I also have MB officials here that after we finish this, if there's any really detailed questions that you have, that we can dig into those a bit more. So firstly, as planned, we're moving to improve New Zealand's post-Marsden Point refinery fuel supply resilience with obligations to hold more onshore fuel stocks. Fuel importers and wholesalers with bulk storage facilities will have to hold a minimum of approximately 28 days cover for petrol, 24 days cover for jet fuel and 21 days cover for diesel on a 3-month rolling average basis. The government will also additionally separately procure at least 70 million litres of reserve diesel stocks onshore, which is roughly equivalent to 7 days cover for more normal diesel demand. These represent either the same or more fuel resilience that we had when Marsden was operating. This reflects the diesel onshore stockholding. The government's separate procurement reflects the importance of diesel for the operation of critical services and deliveries of food and essential goods. Transport fuels currently underpin the day-to-day running of our economy, and it's vital that we have good resilience in this fuel. The second thing I want to talk to you about is the biofuels obligation. Secondly, we're allowing the fuel industry another year to successfully deploy sustainable biofuels, with the obligation now applying from 1 April 2024 instead of next year on 1 April 2023. We also recognise that although the additional cost of biofuels on people is likely to be relatively small, these are tough economic times, so we're pulling back on any potential costs given the global context of fuel prices at the moment. And this supports a range of actions we've taken to ease the pressure on families, alongside the extension of our fuel tax cut, reduced road user charges and half-price public transport until January 2023. The delay on the obligation will allow the fuel sector more time to build the necessary infrastructure and source appropriate feedstocks to meet its requirements. And the third piece that we're announcing today is the progress we've made with the regulatory backstop. We're beefing up the previous actions to increase competition in the fuel sector, with the Commerce Commission being able to step in if necessary to ensure that motorists do get that better and fairer deal at the pump. Since our fuel market study and the subsequent legislation that we passed in 2020 to bring more transparency and competition into the sector, fuel companies' profit margins have lowered. When we announced the fuel market study, regular petrol margins were at about 33 cents per litre. The most recent data we had for the week ended the 4th of November, they were about 17 cents per litre. So we have seen a decline in those margins for the fuel companies. The increased transparency through the changes we have made means we can track and monitor exactly what is happening in the market. The next step that we're announcing today is to enable the Commerce Commission to set fair prices if they find that they are excessive. While high fuel prices are largely driven by international supply costs outside of our control, we're ensuring that pricing is consistent with what can be expected in a transparent and competitive market. And I'm happy to take any questions. I realise there's quite a lot in there.
Why do we need those on reserves? So how precarious have our fuel stocks been, or are they?
Well, this piece of work was something that was always going to happen after Refining NZ made the decision to close Marsden Point, that we needed to look at how it was when we moved to finished products that we as a country have fuel resilience. So this is work that has been underway for a period of time. It's a natural flow on from that decision. What we've looked at is what did we have before when Marsden Point was operating, and what do we need and how can we get that with finished products. So if I talk about diesel, when Marsden Point was operating, we would have about 20 days of consumption of stocks. With what we're doing now, we have 28 days. With jet fuel, when Marsden was operating, we had about 17 days of jet fuel that was held onshore. We'll be moving to 24 days. With petrol, we had about 26 days of consumption. With the changes we're making, we'll move to 28 days. There were about 5 days of additional held in crude spread across all three fuels. So we're seeing around the same or more fuel resilience with the onshore resilience package that we're announcing today.
Just on those stocks, what goes into calculating why it's 28 days and 24 days and 7 days?
Consumption data, what it is that we need. We also, in addition to that, will have 17 days of fuel on the water at any one time on the way here. One of the things with moving to a finished product rather than the fuel being refined at Marsden Point is we don't have a single source of failure anymore. So if the refinery were not to work, then that would affect fuel right across the country. With us importing finished product, we have more destinations that the fuel's coming from, and we have around 17 days of that on the water. So that's kind of good historic data around what we need. And as
can you step through the sort of scenario where the Commerce Commission would step into the fuel?
Sure. So one of the things that we instituted through the fuel market study as a result of that was what we call terminal gate pricing, which is largely the requirement for wholesale prices from the terminals to be advertised. This has allowed more entrants to enter the market, and to particularly we've seen in the South Island more of the smaller petrol companies moving in and operating there. What the Commerce Commission now have the powers to do if they see that there's anti-competitive behaviour, if there's price cooperation, or if there are prices that suggest that market power is being exerted, either the Commerce Commission or the Minister can request that the Commerce Commission investigate what is underlying that to see whether or not there is anti-competitive behaviour occurring.
It would be a discretionary action based on the various dynamics as opposed to a specific threshold or a point?
Yes, that's right. So if there's suspicion that the anti-competitive behaviour, either market power being exerted or that there is price cooperation happening across the fuel companies.
So they can say prices cannot go above this level, or how would actually that work for the consumer in the market? Would it just be a roof over?
So the first step would be the Commerce Commission would investigate to see whether or not there was anti-competitive behaviour that was occurring. If they found that there was anti-competitive behaviour occurring, then they would have the ability to regulate what would be a fair price.
So what kind of time frame would that be? I mean, are we talking about a short-term reaction or going into another sort of lengthy study?
No, it wouldn't be as detailed as the fuel market study. It would be a particular investigation into what was happening from that terminal in terms of the wholesale prices.
How long does that take? I mean, are people, high prices and then what, 2-3 months later there's a remedy, or is it supposed to be a quite immediate fix?
It will be much faster. I'll just ask officials what the information we have from the Commerce Commission on how long that would take.
It's pretty difficult to tell. It'll be kind of probably 6 to 12 months. Kind of.
Yep.
So 6 to 12 months, and I understand, why that time could be taken, but that's not necessarily a fix to consumer high prices, is it?
So one of the things that we have seen since we've introduced the Fuel Act and we've started implementing the outcomes of the market study, that transparency and these tools actually have resulted in us having lower margins on petrol. The existence of the ability to do this actually is a protection for consumers. That the fuel companies know that these tools exist. They will not want the Commerce Commission doing an investigation into whether or not there's price cooperation or whether market power is being exerted. And I think we can look to the evidence of what we've seen with fuel margins in the time since we've instituted these changes. This is just the next step. We've already had the transparency of, for the first time, having to display those prices mirroring the regime that Australia has. So I think that yes, 6 to 12 months seems like a long time, but I think you can also argue that the mere existence of those tools.
Fuel companies to change their their habits if they are not competitive, as opposed to actually imposing it on them?
Well, it can be imposed, and that is what has changed. This did not exist before. So the ability for the Commerce Commission to look into these things did not exist before. This is a new power. This is something that hasn't existed and certainly will be a key lever that is there to protect consumers, to ensure that competitive pricing is occurring. And again, I point to the evidence of what we've seen, which has largely been a voluntary regime up till here, that we've seen those margins come down since we announced the market study, where they were sitting around 33. It was sitting around 33 cents a litre, and as I said at the end of last week, it was 17 cents a litre in terms of the margins. Sorry, I'll just go here.
Is there a sense that the spot pricing hasn't been adequate, that it has been too high? Are there those suspicions there?
Oh, look, we have been monitoring fuel margins all the way through since we instituted the cut in excise duty, because we wanted to ensure as a government that those savings were being passed on to consumers, that it was 25 cents extra in the consumer's pocket per litre, not 25 cents extra profit for fuel companies. So we've been monitoring that really closely. What we have seen is there has been that pass on of that savings to consumers. This is the natural progression of the work that was instituted because of the fuel market study that we carried out in government last term. This was always going to occur. This is about our program of work as a government to ensure that we have a more competitive fuel industry which is delivering more value for consumers.
Sorry, I was referring to the wholesale cost, the importers, how they set the spot price for the entrants to buy. That's what the Commerce Commission is going to be able to look at.
Yes,
right?
and that's...
So has that been too high?
So one of the things that the fuel market study found was that we didn't have the same level of transparency in some of our wholesale markets if you compared us to Australia. And that's why terminal gate pricing, some of those things, I think just about one of the patterns that we're starting to see with a number of the market studies is actually looking at wholesale markets, whatever the category of goods that you're looking at. So that has where quite a bit of the attention has focused of how we can make sure that we've got competitive wholesale markets. But in the case of fuel, it was also how we could allow more entrants to spread to different parts of the country. So when we started the fuel market study, for example, we didn't have some of the smaller, more independent fuel companies operating in the South Island. Consequently, we saw higher petrol prices in the South Island since the fuel market study, that we have actually seen some of those players, Waitomo's, MPD, some of the smaller companies move into the South Island, and we have seen cheaper petrol prices in the South Island.
And what's the timeline for the backstop and the onshore fuel supply?
So in terms of the onshore fuel supply, there will be a post-negotiation report back to Cabinet in March next year around both the purchase of the diesel and also the infrastructure for storage, where we're going to store 70 million litres of diesel. There's a number of options that are available, so that work will progress from here on in. Yeah, so we'll be looking forward to the report back in March of where we've got to with those commercial negotiations. But it will be the expectation it'll be late 23, early 24.
And the backstop, is that going straight away?
That work, the regulatory backstop starts the implementation timeline of that starts straight away. I'll get you a detailed timeline on that.
And just on Marsden Point, we sort of knew that was going in April. Why such a long time? There's quite a lot of international instability in fuel supplies. Should New Zealand have been ready prior to this?
Oh, this is work that has been underway since it was clear, before, middle of last year, that Refining New Zealand was considering shutting down Marsden Point and making those decisions. So this is work that has been underway. We have been getting ready for this. When you look at the resilience that we have now, it's not like we don't have any stocks. Really what we're doing is increasing the onshoring of diesel to make sure that we have got resilience. This isn't work that has just happened because of the current international context. In terms of the war in Ukraine, this is work that has been progressing since it became clear that Marsden was shutting down and has been well signalled. Sorry, Jane.
Can you detail the obligations on biofuels at the moment under the Sustainable biofuels, obligation and the difference that the sector will now have and what that will mean for them? Like, what's the scale of the change there?
So it's the implementation date that is changing. So that what we know is that that if we had pushed on with the April 2023 implementation date, that could have added 6 to 10 cents a litre to diesel. Which obviously in the current context, in terms of pressure on cost of living and consumers' pockets, that was something as a government we were not prepared to do. Those costs would have been because the infrastructure would have been set up, but also the cost of biodiesels has been tracking really closely with the cost of diesel. And diesel internationally has seen a price spike because it's a fuel that can be substituted into home heating and industrial or process heat in Europe at the moment.
The was for them to increase the proportion of
that's right.
So that would just be delayed for a year.
Yes. That's right. So it would have been 0.23 of a megatonne of emissions in that first year. But what we also know from talking closely to the fuel companies with the way the global context was shaping up, many of the fuel companies were looking at simply paying the fines for not fulfilling their obligations rather than actually being able to fulfil the obligation. So we wouldn't have seen the emissions reductions anyway. And that is something that we were not prepared to do in terms of cost pass on to consumers, whether it be when they're filling up their own cars with diesel or obviously our logistics infrastructure using diesel as a delivery fuel, which would have been a pass on a variety of goods and services. So this extra year will actually smooth the cost of the implementation of that through to 2024, and it won't be as steep in April 2024.
So was the date too optimistic then?
Oh, the date was.
Or did wholesalers drag their feet in terms of the infrastructure?
No, well, I think we made the decision in November 2021 around the implementation date. The world has changed a lot in terms of fuel. And what is happening in terms of the global context of fuel since November last year with the war in Ukraine, prices and consumption patterns.
Right, and just on that delay, on the surface it sounds like a compromise of emissions targets for cost of living. Is that accurate?
No, because the emissions targets across the entire emissions reduction budget will largely stay the same.
Yes, but that's later on.
The first budget through to 2025. So if we're looking at that in terms of the implementation, it was going to be a very small emissions reduction in the first year. As I said, it is 0.23 of a megatonne. That's probably equivalent to 1 or 2 giddy projects in terms of the ability to make that up. Of course, when Cabinet looked at this, we had to think, well, if we're not going to get those emissions reductions from here, we have to get it from somewhere else in order to meet our emissions reductions budgets. But that is entirely doable because it is a relatively small emissions reduction.
Where do you expect to procure the additional tank capacity?
So there's a variety of options. So there is the ability to convert some of the tanks at Marsden into storage facilities. There's also options in Taranaki, and there are a variety of options around the country. That will be what that March report back to Cabinet will be post-negotiation around where we're procuring the infrastructure. Not only do we have to procure the diesel, but we also need to sort out the storage facilities.
The government doesn't expect to have to pay for the construction of new tanks?
We're confident that there are existing infrastructure. It may need to be converted for it to be used as storage, and that will be procurement that begins now and have that report back in March.
In the situation that there is suspicion that wholesalers are sort of putting extra prices on or that there are excessive costs and the regulatory backstop comes into play, then investigation is launched 6 to 12 months. Are you confident that those wholesalers will act in, good faith while that investigation is ongoing? Because it sounds like that in that period there's no sort of backstop, there's no interference in terms of what can actually be done short term.
Well, I think one of the things that we have seen post the fuel market study is that we do have a more competitive environment for fuel. that we have more players, that we don't have as narrow a range of fuel companies operating throughout the country as we did prior to 2018. So I think that there will be more choice for consumers, and consumers will shop around as they do now. But I think what we have seen is more transparency in our fuel markets. We can just compare those fuel margins, what they are today compared to what they were when we announced the fuel market study, right back at the beginning, that we have seen quite a dramatic decrease. Now, of course, those fuel margins do move around. They have been as high as 40 cents when we were in lockdown, for example, the fuel margins, because of less consumption, that they did spike quite high then, and we have seen them move around. But we are carefully monitoring them, and I think, like all things, transparency can also drive behaviours.
And on bio, just on bio.
Just on biofuels, why wasn't the sector
well, there's the changing context in terms of fuel markets. I think that can't be ignored, and particularly when it comes to biodiesel, that it's in greater demand with the war in Ukraine, because there is a global tightness in the market for diesel, because it's a ready substitution for other fuels that are being used in home heating and industrial process heat in Europe, and that's something that wasn't envisioned when we set the date back in November 2021. There is from infrastructure that needs to be put in place, but look, we've been pragmatic about this. If we can't meet it, we can't meet it. We're not going to impose additional costs on consumers, so we've worked with the sector and we've pushed the date out.
Because your indication was that fuel suppliers...
Sorry. No, that this extra year will give us time in order to do that.
So if you didn't extend that, so just going back to your previous comment, it was your understanding that suppliers were just going to pass that cost on to consumers?
Oh, undoubtedly, that is something that would have ended in consumers' pockets, and something that we weren't prepared to do.
Right, and just on the anti-competitive behaviour, how many examples or how many times have we seen that portrayed in the sector?
Well, it's not in place yet, so that I can't give you a number of times that there's been an instance when it's been brought to play. What we have been doing, however, through the time in which we've been monitoring the fuel margins with the pass on of making sure that we're getting the savings from the excise duty going into consumers' pockets, I think there's been one instance when I've written to fuel companies and said, don't understand what's happening with your margins, please explain.
In respect to the biofuels, was anything else considered other than pushing it out a year? I mean, are we at risk of sort of always putting climate change on the back burner ahead of an immediate crisis?
No, I just want to be very clear. This is not putting climate change on the back burner. We have carefully looked at the foregone emissions reductions and whether that can be made up elsewhere in the economy. It can be. It is a small emissions reduction. We have not reduced the total amount of emissions reductions that we need to see over the first emissions reduction budget. So this is in no way putting climate change on the back burner. It's making sure that we're doing this in a sustainable way, both for the environment and for consumers' pockets, but never losing sight of what we have to achieve with our emissions reduction budgets either.
So just to clarify on that point, because in your release you've got the adjustments on the intensity targets and the intervening years will be made to make up for the year's delay. So when will those adjustments be made? So when will we catch up essentially between 2024 and 2035? So
we will need to catch up over that entire period, whether it is from transport through sustainable biofuels, or whether it's from needing to, for example, get some more emissions reductions through industrial and process heat. But emissions budgets mean that if you're not going to meet a target in one area, somewhere else has to come into play in the economy. We've looked at what the emissions reductions in this first year would have been. As I said, it's 0.23 of a megatonne. That is entirely doable and making up in terms of transport and other parts of the economy if we needed to.
So do you know where you're going to get that from?
Well, I mean, in terms of most of it will be made up.
That's over 12
No. Most of it will be made up to the 2025 budget in transport itself. So we have. No, with the sustainable. So most of the savings that we were going to see through sustainable biofuels do not come in to the 24 to 25 year anyway. So that we've done all those calculations and looked at that at detail. Yeah.
Okay, so when we look at the overall impact on the price of the pump, how would you characterise what impact it's going to have there, across these three market changes?
So I think one of the things that we've said is this is about making sure that we've got that balance of resilience, sustainability and competitiveness in our fuel markets right. That's why we're presenting this as a package. It's about making sure we're planning for our future and that we're protecting New Zealanders' hip pocket as we go through.
But has there been any estimation on just how the collective impact of these changes, what the impact will be on?
I think we can already see that. We can look at what margins on fuel were before we instituted the market study, and we can look at what margins on fuel are today. 33 cents when we initiated the study, 17 cents at the end of last week. Thank you.